Anybody else feel like August is the Sunday of summer? It is the perfect time to hit reset before the autumn rush. And for me, I start with my wardrobe. Quince proves that you do not need a big crowded closet to look incredible. You just need a few of the right pieces. They specialize in effortless, high quality essentials. Quince has ultra soft organic cotton, premium Mongolian cashmere sweaters, beautifully tailored, built to last, fit properly, and they transition seamlessly from morning meetings to dinner after work. Quince has premium stretch denim that starts at just $50 with the kind of perfect fit and structure and weight that you might look for a long time and only expect to find from a luxury brand. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar quality brands. They work directly with ethical factories, cut out the middlemen, so what you pay for is quality rather than brand markup. And it isn't just apparel. Quince also brings the same kind of elevation to hotel quality bedding, bath and kitchen staples, essentials, and thoughtfully designed furniture. I am a big sucker for handbags of all kinds. Lately, I have been carrying the Italian quilted stitched sling bag everywhere. I bought it in two different colors, cream for summer, and I will be wearing it in the brown color for fall. That is one of my favorites, and it makes me a fan of Quince every time I get a compliment. Upgrade your everyday. Download the Quince app for app-exclusive offers or go to quince.com/KERA. Get free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada and the UK as well. That is QUINCE.com/KERA.
This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
The classic American attitude toward hard work is bring it on. Many of us were raised to believe we could achieve anything if we put in enough effort. But many members of Gen Z entering the workforce in this era of gig work, BS jobs, and AI being trained to replace human labor, they formed a different conclusion, which is that striving is for suckers. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. It's not that these young adults are unwilling to work at all. They're just not convinced that their jobs should sit at the center of their lives or that exhausting their energy and attention on a career is likely to pay dividends. My guest is a few years older. She is a millennial who started her work life with guidance to lean into her big ambitions. But lately, she started to wonder whether the generation coming up behind her is onto something. Emmy Neatfeld is a journalist. Her recent essay for the New York Times is titled Gen Z Fell Out of Love with Work. I don't blame them. Emmy, welcome to Think.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
You wrote a memoir a few years ago about the hardships in your childhood. Just for purposes of this discussion, what should we know about the perspective that you formed about hard work and its potential benefits starting when you were a teenager?
I grew up in a pretty tough family situation. Both my parents struggled with mental illnesses, and it meant that I spent time in foster care and as a teenager with periods of homelessness. I also grew up hearing from my mom, who had dreamed about going to Stanford. She was always talking about if I had only gone to Stanford, my life would be so different. And so when I was a teenager, I believed that there was this path out of my really depressing family situation and economic instability by, get into the right college, study the right major, and then graduate and have this economic success.
So you built this identity for yourself as a striver, right? Someone who could overcome things. What do you think, Emmy, that did for you, and what did it maybe do to you as you got older?
Well, it gave me this sense that I wasn't just living in my present, that I was living in my future. So even though I was sleeping in my car at one point, I was sleeping in my car studying for the SAT. I believed that I wasn't just what was going on at that moment, but that there was so much more in front of me. And I think that can sound really cheesy to say, but it really was true. This sense of like, I am also my future. At the same time, I really drove myself into the ground. I struggled with depression, with eating disorders, with self-harm, and the adults around me were like, "Well, it's because you're so stressed." Right? Because you believe that if you don't like achieve all this stuff, your life isn't worth anything. And, in hindsight, I think they probably had a point.
I mean, was there part of you in those early days that wondered like when you would be able to stop trying so hard?
Yeah, yeah. I thought, maybe one day I would have enough money to be able to like buy a Frappuccino every day and then I would have made it,
Yeah.
right? And then just everything was going to be easy, everything was going to be perfect. And I don't think I really realized that striving is not just a behavior you do one day or for one year. It becomes something that's part of your personality and it's really ingrained into your sense of like self-worth and even your sense of morality.
You finished college, you actually went to Harvard and started at Google ready to lean in, which was the order of the day. By the time you left Google, you felt really differently about the company. Talk a little bit about what made that a bad experience and how it sort of reframed the way you thought about work altogether.
When I entered Google, I just felt like I had really made it. I could definitely afford a Frappuccino every day. I could afford like three a day. And I was working in this job that was like the hot job. Google was one of the most beloved companies in the country. And I really felt like I had found a community in my coworkers. I found a lot of meaning in my work. And then I went through a sexual harassment situation, which is honestly what happened to me is what happens to tons and tons of young women and even young men. And I reported it to HR, went through an investigation process, and by the end, I was totally jaded about the corporate world, about believing that your company was a place that was like a family or something that loved you. And so it did really change my view on what it means to love a job.
Yeah. First of all, I'm really sorry that that happened to you. You started thinking maybe you should be careful about ever loving any job again.
Yeah. Yeah, I did. And I went and I actually worked at a company that I thought was kind of evil and soulless. And I just wanted to see what it felt like to work at a place like that, right? To really decouple my love from what I did. And spoiler alert, it was really awful. And I only lasted like 9 months. But I was going through this shift that so many Americans were going through at the same time. It was 2021 when I left Google and or 2020 2019, I don't know, one of those years. It was that era where we were all kind of falling out of love with work and realizing, like, wow, we've given ourselves so much to these companies and they don't owe us anything in return.
So let's talk now about Gen Z, which is coming right up behind millennials. Members of Gen Z are now in their mid teens to late 20s. And I will note, of course, I recognize that I'm making some broad generalizations here, but generally, Emmy, how does that generation think about work?
The ways that I think about work as a source of meaning and selfhood and transcendence, that is completely foreign to Gen Z. This process of becoming disillusioned, that has already happened to, I'd say, most members of Gen Z. The relationship to work is totally different, where it's something much more transactional. It's much more about making money and less more about making meaning. And there's no longer this belief that work really should be at the center of your identity or even the center of your life.
And this is even members of Gen Z who are leaving school with like a lot of education. It's not simply people who, didn't finish. People are still struggling to find decent jobs that would actually use all the knowledge and the skills they've been building through their education.
I think there's this sense that a lot of people have been tricked or swindled, where you grow up and you hear you have to go to college, a college education is necessary. One student I talked to was like, I thought there was this clear path in front of me from college to a job. And this student, he studied computer science, he worked in IT all through college, and he still applied to more than 200 jobs before getting a job through a connection.
Emmy, for anyone listening who hasn't applied sort of cold for a job in a long time, will you just talk a little about how it works now that most companies post open positions on these massive online portals?
So there's Indeed, that's one of the big ones. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs, but people from all over the world are applying. They're often applying using bots. They're applying using like AI resumes, AI written cover letters, and then the companies are using AI tools to screen out applicants. And there's been some reporting about how these screening tools are often pulling wrong data, like about people's GPAs or their history. Like it's not even necessarily going off of the facts, and people are just being rejected en masse. And so there's really this sense that like the jobs that are being posted aren't even real, that it's just companies, they've already found the person they want to hire, but for legal reasons, they have to post the job. And so each job application is like essentially feels hopeless. And there's so many that you have to get through. I think we've always kind of known getting a job is all about who you know. But I think that actually has come to a different level today with today's young people. And it's really upsetting to them because if you're 20 years old or 22 and you don't come from a family with a lot of connections, like how are you supposed to know people?
You talked to some graduating university students about their job searches, and they're not just frustrated or demoralized. They're terrified. What kind of fears do they have about the future?
There's this sense that all of the good jobs are being replaced by AI. Like there are still jobs, but it's things like loading in a warehouse or being a home health aide making poverty wages. And so especially for students who have gone through college and who have taken out student loans, and I'm talking about really students who did everything the right way. Like they did exactly what liberal arts students are told to do. They studied what interests them. They worked really hard. Like these are the type of students who a decade ago in a good economy, might have easily found a job being an assistant or just having any entry level normal job. And the sense is just that those jobs are not there. And how are you going to support yourself? And increasingly, how are you going to support your aging parents?
Mm. It's such a turnaround because I think in this country we have a long history of faith in the idea that anybody willing to work hard enough will eventually be rewarded. We could go through a litany of reasons that hasn't been equally true for everybody, but generally many people believed it. Gen Z has this sense that the ones rewarded are the exception, that like eternally struggling is more like the rule of the economy they're graduating into.
I think that those expectations have totally changed. And I think a lot of critics want to point this on Gen Z and say, well, they just don't have enough faith. They just don't have enough hope. But there's really a lot of data that this is reflecting the changing reality of the job market, where if you are in the same job for 10 years or 20 years, you're probably not getting wage raises that track with inflation. Jobs are way less linear than they used to be. There's a lot more hopping required. And so many of the ways that young people like make it big, they have nothing to do with that effort like day to day, or they don't appear to have effort day to day. It's like, you see people get rich doing day trading or doing crypto or OnlyFans, or as a social media influencer. And those are really like windfall economies where most of the time nothing happens or you just lose all your money, but sometimes you strike it rich. And so basically the workplace seems more like a casino than it does like you're training for a marathon.
And you learned that members of Gen Z believe they need to earn a lot of money before they could possibly feel financially stable, let alone financially successful. How much are we talking about here?
There was a survey that suggested that Gen Z said they needed almost $600,000 a year to feel financially successful.
Wow.
And so that would put you in the top, yeah, in the top 2% of earners. And I mean, that's kind of a shocking number. And if you look at the like longer term data, people say they need to be in about the top 5% of earners to feel successful. And now that number is like 600K. And it was kind of surprising to hear students, even who came from like pretty poor backgrounds, telling me that they thought they needed $200,000 a year, like just to be stable. And a lot of that was driven by like high costs, by thinking like in order to have a better life than my parents had, I don't need 10% more money. I need three times as much money or six times as much money. And I think there's also this sense that as the social safety net falls apart, you need to be able to build your own safety net and be able to build a safety net for your family. Because a lot of students today are very worried about their parents. Like some graduating students I talk to, their parents are like 80.
That's really interesting, this idea that young people, young adults feel like no one is coming to rescue them. Their parents maybe can't and the government won't.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, how has that assessment of financial stability affected the sense that Gen Z feels like they could ever have a family if they want one?
When people are talking about the declining birth rate and fertility, the percentage of Gen Z that says they want to have kids, I think it's close to 50%, which is very, very low if you compare it to millennials or any really generation before. And I definitely think finances are a huge driving factor of that, where people feel like, okay, maybe I can, have stability for myself. And other people I talked to were like, well, I'm just not going to have stability, right? I want to be a marine biologist or a musician. And so I'm just going to be poor. I might die early because I can't have health insurance, but like that is the type of trade-off that I need to make for myself. And if you're in that position, you can't really bring a kid into that.
Emmy, how would you say where youthful striving does exist, how does it look different than when you started your kind of post-college career about a decade ago?
Young people today are really bullish on entrepreneurship. About two-thirds of young adults say they would like to be entrepreneurs. And when I was interviewing students for the story, even the mechanical engineers and the civil engineers were like, I want to run my own civil engineering company, or I want to work for myself. Versus a decade ago when I was graduating, it was all about, oh, what's the hot company, right? It's like, I want to work at Google or I want to work at Palantir. When I was interviewing students, not a single person named a company that they wanted to work for.
Wow. I mean, as a journalist, if you don't mind my asking, are you freelance or do you work for a company?
I've been freelance for about 5 years, and then I'm planning to join a company imminently.
So there are pros and cons to either side.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's a sense of like, if you are a freelancer, you can control your destiny. You have more control over things like personal branding, which matters more now than ever. And then on the flip side, you probably don't have health insurance unless it's coming from your parents or from a partner.
I do not have an entrepreneurial instinct, and I really admire it in anyone of any age. But I mean, if you think about it, entrepreneurship historically has offered very high rewards, also very high risks. What are the appeals of taking on the risks of working for yourself as opposed to the risks of working for a company and just not, rising as high as you might like?
Well, I think that the company jobs used to seem really stable, and now there's a sense that a boss can always fire you, that you don't have tenure anymore. A lot of people are seeing that they don't have promotion as much as they'd like. There's data that the average length of time until a first promotion is getting longer and longer. And so I think that like a lot of the students I talked to, there was the sense of like, it's not even worth it to play that game for those rules, that just the potential payoff is not high enough. And maybe that will change when people are, getting ready to have kids or settle down or something like that, and they want less risk. But right now, it almost seems like the risky path is the safer path.
So I'm going to sound like your aunt here, and I'm aware of that risk, but I'm Gen X, and I do remember like in the first years of my career, things felt tenuous. It was very financially challenging. I would imagine there are boomers out there who felt the same way when they were starting out. What tells you that what Gen Z is experiencing is truly something different rather than just these young workers currently living through whatever life stage precedes feeling settled as an adult?
Researchers who study generational differences, they really don't think, oh, one generation is totally different than another generation. Typically, what they're looking at is this age effect, what you're mentioning, right? Where when you're 18, you tend to feel different than you feel at 22, than you feel at 25. And that combines with these larger societal impacts, like how everybody feels a little more disillusioned with work than we did 7 years ago. And so I think what you're seeing here with new college graduates is that there is this dismal job market, the vibes are terrible, and you have people who are at this really formative stage of their life and their career, and it's kind of a terrible, terrible combination. And there is also a lot of evidence, like from the Great Recession, where students who are graduating into the recession, they still have worse outcomes today. And so just the time period that you're released into the world at really, really makes a big difference.
How were you as a millennial shaped by the lean in culture that was everywhere around the time you were looking for your first job?
I feel like I am so cringe because I really am a big believer in, like, hard work can feel amazing, even if it's not very remunerative. Like I always put my heart and soul into every story I do, even if, I'm make nothing from it. So I feel like talking to these kids, I'm like, wow, I'm really a sucker, right? That I interpreted this hard work thing as like a moral positive. And I do think it's really smart to be asking why. But I grew up religious. I grew up in like a Calvinist home where hard work is how you prove that you're, basically worthy, that you're a member of the elect class chosen by God. And now that just seems like a relic from ancient history, but I mean, it really is a part of who I am on almost a visceral level.
Your article made me think about, the pandemic when a lot of people were leaning out, they were quiet quitting, they were sort of doing the bare minimum and very stressed. I mean, I don't mean to make a moral judgment about people making this call. A lot of people also started saying, I'm not going to do that. And, putting guardrails around what they were willing to do for their salary. And that has not been the way that I've worked over time. And I have always really loved my work. But it did cause me to think, and your article caused me to think, like, what have older generations missed out on by being too afraid to even question what it is we're asked to do by our jobs?
Yeah. Yeah. I went through that as well, talking to these young people, where I basically had an existential crisis where I was like, oh my God, what have I done with my life? Right? Like, I was a software engineer. Now I've been a freelance journalist. Like, I haven't made that much money, right? I have a young child who I could have spent more time with. It really forced me to reckon with my own values. And speaking to professors and staff who work at universities, they really tended to tell me that what they see in their students is a positive change, that it's a good thing to be thinking more about your relationships and your health and your hobbies and prioritizing your work a little bit less.
Tell us about Alejandra Perez that you interview in the article. What is her story?
So she grew up the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She was part of her family's beekeeping business from a very young age. Her entire family worked really hard. She worked really hard as part of it, and she sees a future for herself in entrepreneurship. And I think she is really a role model for what Gen Z ambition looks like today, where it's focused on entrepreneurship and it's also focused on her personal values, where for her, it's really important to be running a business, but to be running it from home and very involved with raising her own children.
She doesn't seem to be all that interested in material things for their own sake, but she told you she expects to be able to build her business so that she someday earns seven figures. I mean, I was really excited for her, and I hope it all turns out that way. But that sounds like a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, I think people always want to say, oh, the young generation, they are unrealistic, or, their heads are in the clouds. But I think hopefully all of us were somewhat, unrealistic at that age, and just, kind of brimming with optimism. I think especially to be an entrepreneur, you do have to really, really, really believe in yourself.
Yeah, I guess it certainly doesn't help to dream of less than you think you're capable of.
Yeah, and that was one of her interesting points about, some of her friends and classmates, where she does see a lot of people like limiting themselves, and she has chosen, I don't want to do that. I want to I want the sky to be the limit for what I can achieve.
And she seems to have understood from, even I guess when she was still in school, she was not interested in any kind of corporate job to utilize her skills.
I think that she ultimately wants to go to entrepreneurship, but to be fair to her, I think that she sees corporate jobs as a stepping stone where you can learn a lot of skills that for her she would use later on in doing her own thing. And so I do see that as different than this traditional idea of like, oh, let me climb the corporate ladder versus let me have this job that I'm going to use as a way to invest in myself.
To go back to this question of, many members of Gen Z feel like they need a whole lot of money before they can even think about having children. This is something that seems to make them quite significantly different from your generation, right? Talk about this 2010 Pew survey of millennials, your generation, that found what people prioritized in their lives.
In this 2010 survey, millennials said that their top priorities were having a happy marriage and having kids. So very focused on family versus polls about Gen Z. They also say that many people want kids, many people want to be in a happy partnership, but that financial independence is a bigger priority. And I think there's multiple ways to define financial independence, but colloquially, it often means having so much money that you don't have to work to make a living.
Yeah, and I guess, maybe people are assessing like a hierarchy of needs here. Like they would love to have a family, but they feel like that's not even possible if they are worried about money.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's a big part of what's going on. And I think people are also really aware of the challenges that are facing parents today and just of how unhappy so many American parents are and how much of that comes from financial stress, from not being able to afford daycare or a babysitter, where things are just totally different if you do have the money to pay for that kind of stuff.
You also found some polling that revealed more than half of the people in Gen Z say that if they could, they would like to be influencers. And I'm curious as to whether that survey revealed, or you got a sense of whether people truly see this as a plausible path overall, or is it similar to saying more than half of Gen Z would like to be pro athletes or movie stars if they could?
I think it's both. I think a lot of people believe that they could be an influencer and are like, diligently posting, hoping that one day they're going to get a million followers. And I think that it's a reflection of the way that you actually do have a lot of power as an influencer, right? You see these political candidates like AOC or Mamdani who are very skilled with social media, and that's a big part of why they get elected. And so I think that that's kind of this generation's currency for power.
That's so interesting. So it's also a path to like agency and positive attention potentially.
Among younger students, there's even this sense of like, in order to get a job, I have to have an active presence on social media. That is like more important than what you would have on your resume, is showing that you're like a social media expert, basically.
It's a lot to ask. It's like a career outside of your career to hang on to your career.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist dealing with social media, I am so much happier since I pretty much stepped away from it. So I applaud people who are doing it for like being able to handle all that stress.
So to go back to this research that Gen Z workers have decided like they would rather have financial independence than a family, is that driven by the assumption that most people are not going to be able to have both?
I think that's increasingly the assumption. When I was talking to students, the people who were like, I want to do marine biology or some other career that's not particularly remunerative, they were like, I just can't have kids. Like, that's just not in the cards for me. It's not something I could afford, so I can't even want it. And I think our country has a really interesting relationship with childbearing because we both are always talking about the declining birth rate. Conservatives especially love to talk about it. They love to tell people, you need to get married early, you need to have kids younger, you need to have more kids. And at the same time, we have this really long-standing, deeply held belief that you should only have children that you can personally pay for. And that second belief really limits the pool of people who can afford to have kids, especially if finances are getting tighter for 90% of Americans.
We also talk about it just, having children now as like an incredibly labor intensive thing because it is more labor intensive than it might once have been.
Yeah, I mean the data on this that the average working mom today spends more time with her children than the average stay-at-home mom did in like the 50s is crazy. Like the expectations of parents is that they are really always there, super intensive parenting, and often it's not really a choice you can opt out of because, kids are only in school for so many hours a day. Like when I was a kid, my parents would just be like, "Go outside and don't come back." And nowadays, if you do that, like your child will get picked up by CPS and you might not get them back.
Alejandra told you that she was not willing to sacrifice her personal life for some fancy corporate title. How does she define sacrifice as it relates to putting in whatever level of effort on the job?
Well, I think that Alejandra is a really hard worker and that a number of the students that I talk to are willing to work really, really hard. And, definitely as hard as I was willing to work. I just think that there's a different sense of like who are you willing to work hard for and in what ways. And so for Alejandra, what's really important for her is to be able to be with her kids and to be the person who picks them up from school, to be the person, who's taking care of them like day to day, hour by hour. She called her hope being a stay-at-home entrepreneur mom. And so for her, that is like the hard line that she doesn't want to cross. But I think within those constraints, is she willing to work late nights, like put in a lot of effort at first with the hope that she can stay at home later? Yes, I think she's definitely willing to put that in.
We should note you found the anxieties of Gen Z are not only about like, will I someday be able to afford children if I want them? A lot of these folks are not convinced they will find a life partner ever.
Yeah. I mean, the gap between young men and young women is just growing so, so vast. And obviously there's a lot of queer young people too. But just the young women are overwhelmingly far more liberal than young men. And both young men and women are moving towards more like traditional gender roles, but especially young men are thinking about, the woman that they marry being, a homemaker, like just having these traditional roles that both to us might seem a little bit outdated, but also that just don't track with the economic reality where the vast majority of families, no matter what people want to do, like they have to have two income earners. And in most families, at some point, the woman is the breadwinner these days.
Emmy, I did find myself wondering whether this generation, Gen Z, has convinced itself it's not worth even trying to kind of grab the brass ring in a career so they won't be disappointed down the road. Like before even putting in the effort, just assuming that it's not going to happen is almost a way of saving face.
I think that that could very well be true. My research took me into this idea of the locus of control, which is how much agency people feel like they have over their lives. And it's pretty stunning how people now increasingly feel like they have very little control. One college professor surveyed their class in 2024 and found that the average student felt like they had less control over their life than the average prisoner did in 1966.
Wow.
Yes. And I think some of this is really a reflection of ways that individuals do have less agency, where there's just less stability or certainty that if I put in the hard work, it's going to pay off. And the research into locus of control suggests that it's not your sensation of how much control you have isn't something that's constantly updating with your circumstances. If you are in a situation when you're young where you feel totally helpless, for many people that just stays and that sticks around even as you get older. And so I do think that there's a real risk that young people today who have been through COVID, who are graduating into this economy, that they just feel helpless, feel powerless, and that even if they might be able to make steps to improve their lives, that it just doesn't seem worth it.
This is so fascinating. I've been talking to everybody about this since I read your article. You cite a study from 2012 that found the most driven people in our society tend to come from the middle class. First of all, why is that?
The researchers who did the study think that it's because if you're middle class, you're not so rich that you have everything you want handed to you on a silver platter, but you're also not so poor that you can't imagine a way out. So it's kind of that sweet spot in the
Yes.
middle.
So if the middle class is shrinking, as we often hear that it is, although I'll note that there are different ways of measuring this, um, could that account for why Gen Z appears to be less interested in pursuing career ambitions than their elders at the same age?
I think researchers really think that that could be the case. And I think if you're looking at, what form is ambition taking, if you feel like there are fewer paths into the middle class or fewer jobs where just like, steady hard work is going to be rewarded, then yeah, people would be less willing to devote their youth to that.
You talked to someone for the piece named Mecca Durhal who feels very uncertain about the future, and for good reason. How have their job goals changed in response to AI technology that can now do work that just a few years ago could only have been done by a human being?
When they entered college in 2019, I believe, they were hopeful that they could become a writer or an editor or a Japanese translator. And then after the big generative AI companies took off, those jobs have basically been replaced. And that it's not really a viable career option to be like, I want to become a Japanese translator. And so that has really left them scrambling for what kind of job do I get? And, their expectation of jobs are very reasonable, right? Like they express wanting to maybe become an administrative assistant to learn more skills, like learn about an industry. But those jobs are just fewer and fewer, farther and farther between. And that they really feel like the expectations on an entry level employee are way, way higher than what the average college graduate could do.
Gen Z is pretty well known for recognizing the importance of mental health and viewing it as something that they ought to protect. Are they broadly defining mental health as the lack of a diagnosable mental illness, or is it more like the absence of any emotional distress?
I think that mental health now has a very, very wide purview, where there's a sense of any type of personal well-being is under this umbrella of mental health. And, in many ways, it's a positive change. But researchers also really point out that just because you prioritize your mental health doesn't mean that people are taking the steps that actually leads to better mental health. And I think that's one of the great ironies about Gen Z is that they really value relationships, they really value their mental health and physical health, and yet the like actions and behaviors and environment are actually not really conducive to those goals. And so there's some data that Gen Z is on average not that happy and not really thriving. And I think that disconnect between those goals and the behaviors is a part of driving that.
I was thinking about the fact that these young people seem, in my opinion, to be kind of prematurely deciding hard work will never possibly pay off. On the one hand, it feels like they're giving up before they even try. But then it occurred to me, Emmy, that like today's young people in Gen Z have almost universally lived through so much more pressure in school than earlier generations, absolutely more than my generation, including people who went to good colleges and that sort of thing. It just didn't used to feel so very fraught. And maybe they're leaving school kind of already burned out by school.
I feel like that is the vibe from a lot of students that just, that the school environment felt so draining and so burnout inducing, like, oh my gosh, the workplace is going to be even worse. Um, and maybe it will be, but maybe it won't be. I remember when I had my first job, I was like, you're telling me I only have to work 40 hours a week, right? I get to take a vacation day and I get paid for it. I was like, this is so much easier than school.
Well, we will note you went to a very fancy private high school and then you went to Harvard. So you probably had to work harder in school than even everybody else who's stressed about it.
I think Harvard's probably easier than a lot of the state schools out there.
Huh. Nearly half of 18 to 29-year-old Americans currently live with their parents, which was once, we should say, fairly typical, has been far less common in recent decades. What do we know about the reasons for this?
Money, 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 money. It is just so expensive to rent an apartment, and it's increasingly seen as making good financial sense to stay with family members. I think COVID really normalized it, and a lot of young people probably figured out that they actually enjoy living at home and living with their parents, which, as you said, is traditionally what people did do for a lot longer. Um, and I think what's hard about this is when young people really want to live in their own place, that having your own apartment can make it much more conducive to dating, to finding like a marriage partner. Um, but definitely those norms have shifted too. And to many, it seems like people are just going through a longer and longer adolescence before really, really becoming fully fledged adults.
And I can't decide. I mean, the financial component of this aside, it's hard to know whether this might be helping or hurting young people to delay being fully on their own. I mean, no matter how well you and your parents get along, there is going to be a level of scrutiny in both directions that you don't have if you've got your own place.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it seems like if I think about it as a parent, it seems like having my daughter here would be a blessing and a curse, right? I'm sure I would cherish it. And I'm sure part of me would be like, okay, well, I want to walk around the house naked now.
Um, you note in the piece that you felt a little bit sad by this sense of powerlessness that many members of Gen Z seem to have over their own lives and their own futures. Could that sense that they don't have much agency be inaccurate? Is it possible that they just sort of haven't recognized the possibilities that are still out there?
I want to believe that there are a lot of possibilities still out there. And I think it's important to give young people agency and not to just like write off their future for them. And at the same time, I think it's really easy to tell people, oh, you should feel like you have more control over your future, right? Like basically just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, decide that you have control over your life. And I do think there's a lot of psychology research that indicates that that's not really how it works, that we have the sense of power that we do for a reason. And I think that we're going to have to go deeper than kind of telling people have more control in order to actually really address the problem. Like I think we're going to really have to do things that make young people feel like they do have power, they do have control, and they have autonomy from a younger age.
What might that look like?
I think this dovetails a little bit into some of these discussions around like free range parenting and helicopter parenting and how parents just have such an intense role in their kids' lives from an early age. Like I have a toddler, and my husband and I hope that, when she's 7, 6, that she's able to go to the corner store, that she's able to walk around the neighborhood by herself. And I think that when I talk to other people, they're saying that their kids should be like 12 or even 14 before they can leave the house by themselves. And I think that's so different than even a generation ago, right? When I was 12, I was babysitting a newborn baby, right? For like entire days. And I had classmates who were 12-year-old parents and they were raising their kids. And so, obviously that wasn't the norm, but I think that our expectations of what young people are capable of really does need to shift pretty dramatically into like letting children believe that they have autonomy, even in little stuff from like a much, much earlier age.
Of course, older generations love to act as if younger people are uniquely distracted by their phones. I would say it happens to all of us. But how concerned are members of Gen Z about how not AI taking their jobs, but technology that distracts them might affect their ambition and drive?
It was fascinating talking to these college students and hearing their really negative views of technology and their peers' relationships to it, where people were just telling me, AI plagiarism is widespread. people have just lost their ambition because they're scrolling. And I think there's this real sense that you have to fight against the currents. If you want to do anything with your life, you have to be absolutely vigilant about this technology and say no to it. And otherwise, you're just going to be in your parents' basement scrolling when you're 30.
Another question I had was, how will this generation feel in 10 years? Like, for all the romanticizing that we do in our 30s and 40s and 50s about our 20s, most older adults could also look back and recall that, like, the earliest years of adult life are just rough.
Yeah. I mean, I really hope that young people are able to look back and think, wow, I was really anchored in my values. Because the young people I talk to, they are not interested in the traditional script, but they are really assessing, what matters to me? What does a meaningful life look like to me? And I definitely wasn't asking those questions, at least not very hard when I was that age. And so I hope that young people have a sense of satisfaction in that. And I also really hope that these young people do find meaningful work that provides for their needs and that also provides some degree of like emotional satisfaction. I know it's really not hip to be like, oh, I find meaning and fulfillment and identity in my work. But as somebody who does, I do think it's a really wonderful feeling that I wish more people had.
I feel the same way. And I know it doesn't work this way for everyone, but you mentioned already that these young people are not by and large happier because they're not trying too hard. I mean, they don't want to be idiots and work for nothing. But there's also there's a reason to really lean into work that has nothing to do with how much money you might get paid.
Yeah. And I think it's such a big part of our lives, even if you just look at the hours involved. And there's a lot of research into motivation and that extrinsic motivation, like money or fame, it makes people really unhappy. But intrinsic motivation, like a sense of mastery, that really fuels people and does lead to happiness. And I think that this shift away from work as a source of meaning to just becoming a source of money, it really risks making it into something that is purely extrinsic, which I think is much harder to sustain over the long term.
Emmy Neatfeld is a journalist. Her recent essay for the New York Times is titled "Gen Z Fell Out of Love with Work. I Don't Blame Them." Emmy, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.